Is John Oliver a prophet? And what is the future of the church in regards to taxation? You will find out all of those things and more here on the Scott Stedman Podcast.
Churches, America's favourite place for redemption and sixth favourite place for chicken. Churches are a cornerstone of American life. There are roughly 350,000 congregations in the United States, and many of them do great work, feeding the hungry, clothing the poor. But this is not a story about them. This is about the churches who exploit people's faith for monetary gain. And when I say that, you probably think of 1980s television.
Good morning, and it is August 25th. It is about 9 o'clock in the morning here in Stanton, Virginia. It is a beautiful day here, and you are listening to the Scott Stedman Podcast. Now, from the tagline, you are probably aware of what I'm going to talk about. And the clip you just heard is actually the beginning clip of the segment on televangelist from last week tonight with John Oliver. And just from his introduction to this topic, he really talked about, churches are doing great things. They're feeding the poor, they're clothing people, they're really helping people out. But this segment was not about them. It was about the televangelists and some of the bigger churches, I guess, who televise their messages, and really it was a criticism of them. And obviously there will be a link on my website, thescottstedman.com. Where you can actually find the link to watch it, or you can just do a search for John Oliver televangelist, and it should pop up. The video runs for about 20 minutes. Really, when you watch it, the big chunk of it is just him talking about it, and then there's kind of like this last part of it that kind of is like a little funny sketch thing that he's doing. So really don't have to watch the full 20 minutes of it, but you're probably going to watch a big chunk of the whole thing. And really what he was sharing was something that a lot of churches have, that is, or I would say religious organizations have, which is a tax exemption status. Because of religious freedoms, because of our First Amendment, a lot of churches have some tax breaks. They have a tax exemption status, which basically means that they don't really have to pay taxes. Even if you look at ministers, they have certain tax breaks too, because since ministers are considered self-employed, they are kind of, they get taxed a little bit more. They get taxed a little bit more than like your average company. For an example, when I was working at a church in Northeast Ohio, my annual salary was about $20,000. That was. I was bivocational, so I'd have to work another job, and I did. I ended up working at Target, and I also worked at an acting school in the evenings. But the interesting thing is, because without any tax breaks, my dad's a CPA, so he kind of narrowed it down. He told me about, here's the tax breaks that you can do that kind of help put more money in your pocket so you can buy food, clothing, support your family, and even pay some student loans, versus if you did nothing. And one of the things is, if I did not have any type of tax breaks, if I decided not to do and John Oliver talked about this, if I didn't do a parsonage allowance and some of these other tax breaks, basically I would owe the government, and that's federal and state, and I believe local. Actually, I'm not going to say local, because we didn't have to pay local tax where I was, or at least I never got a bill from the city of Cortland saying, "Hey, you owe us taxes." But out of my $20,000, I'd have to give $7,000 to the government, which means that I would only have about $13,000 to pay my student loans, to eat, to pay any other bills, and basically to support my family on $13,000. which is very hard. And I know there's some people who try to support their families and have government assistance and everything else. And this is actually before the whole uh, National Health Care Act, or the Obamacare. So I'm trying to pay for health insurance, just so in case something happened to me. That so here I am paying health insurance, and that was, more money that was being taken out. But actually, that was a tax break. If the church paid for it, then that was kind of a little bit of a tax break for me. So really, I tried to narrow down how much I had to pay in taxes. Um, but what we have been seeing but what John Oliver has been pointing out is he's been really pointing out about these big mega churches or these I don't want to say mega churches because there's some mega churches that actually operate correctly, but really the televangelists who are always hitting people up for money, always trying to do things, and even some of the videos, like one guy was saying how he bought. I don't even remember. It's been a while since I've seen it, but like he bought a airplane or something with cash, like no credit, no loan, anything, straight up cash paid for this jet. And then he ended up paying for a faster jet that was better than the other one with cash. No check, no credit card, no loans, straight up cash. And you just see how a lot of these televangelists are always hitting up these people. And it was very interesting too, because then later on in the segment, John Oliver actually started to send money to one of the televangelists and was actually in correspondence with them, and he kind of pulled out all his letters and kind of showed what was some of the stuff that happened. And he kind of said, hey, and he starts doing all these things. So he's like, oh, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this. And he started to kind of go along with it. And I think he said he ended up spending like almost $375. And he says, it's ridiculous, but it's not really ridiculous when there's people who are actually buying into this and they're being affected. And he showed one story of one woman who her mother was taken advantage. Saw something on TV. I think her mother was dying of cancer, and saw something like, oh, if you give us all this money, we will, your cancer will be cured. And it wasn't. And now the woman was in debt and dead, and it really affected the family. Even my own personal story, I remember my dad would tell me how, I believe it was his Uncle Herbert, so it'd be my great Uncle Herbert, was sick, and he was watching, like most people, if you go to church all the time, especially back then, you go to church, and then when you're sitting at home, you usually watch stuff on church throughout the week. Like almost every day you're going to church, whether it's through the television or you're actually sitting in a congregation. And he saw one of these things like, oh, give us money and we will send you a cloth that's anointed with a healing cloth. And once you get this healing cloth, it will, it'll heal you of any diseases that you have. Or if you are having hard times, you will then, everything will magically disappear. So obviously my Uncle Herbert bought into this, sent money to them, had this healing cloth. He would, rub it over his face, rub it over where he had the disease, and nothing. Like, didn't miraculously cure it, didn't do anything. Now, I know I'm going to be teetering on a very touchy topic, because there's Christians, and I'm one of these Christians that believe that God can do miracles, that God can heal people. I have prayed with people who, I've prayed with people who have illnesses and they were miraculously cured. I have prayed with people and they weren't miraculously cured, but God was able to deliver them from whatever illness they had. And then I've prayed with people to be cured of diseases, and they weren't cured and they end up dying. And so that's always kind of the tricky part is, well, it goes into another question. Why did God chose to miraculously heal this person of their disease, but not this person? And that's always been a huge question, a very a hard question that's asked by people. And usually some of the responses is that, well, God didn't want to do that. God chose not to do it. Or people have said, well, it's because you didn't have enough faith, which I feel. And then and then the other reason, which is kind of the reason I come up with, is, what is God doing? What does God want to do through that person? And I kind of got that view of just from reading Richard Foster's book on prayer, or Celebration of Disciplines, and also his book on prayer, just how he was praying with a woman who wanted to be cured of cancer, and she knew that this was someone who really prayed, that when he prayed, things happen. Someone who was spirit-filled, so she went to go see him, and it was interesting because then, she kind of told him what was going on, what she wanted prayer for. So then Richard Foster, instead of like most people where they just automatically start to go into prayer, he started to do silent prayer, and he asked her to do the same. And as they were praying and praying, he felt a word from the Lord. And he basically told the woman that he was not going to pray for her to cure her for cancer. When she asked why, he says, because what the Lord revealed to me is that he is going to do a great work through you when you are going through your treatments. I don't know what that is, but he's going to do a great work through you. And that woman went through the treatment and everything else, but then, there was some improvements and stuff, because she was actually diagnosed with a severe cancer where there's a small % chance of her surviving, and yet she survived. So in a way, that was a miracle itself. But through that, she was able to baffle doctors, and she was even to plant the seed in some doctors and some nurses who weren't believers, and then they became believers. So really, there's and again, I just diverted off what this whole podcast was, but that's kind of the mysteries of God sometimes. We don't know why, but I think the main thing is if he doesn't really heal you, or he doesn't do anything, then maybe you should kind of pray and go, God, why? And ask him and see what his response is. But in regards to the televangelist, I find it very difficult when people are saying, hey, we're going to give you, if you give us money, we're going to heal you. There's one thing where the guy said, if you're in debt, whatever credit card debt you have, put $1,000, put $1,000 to us on that card, and watch the debt just get wiped away. And there's a part of me that goes, that's, and there's a thing that I like to test things, and when I hear that, there's something inside me that screams, don't do it. That's not going to happen. But like John Oliver says, there's people who buy into this, and there's people who get taken advantage of this. So should there be stricter tax codes? And he even said that, the amount of churches that get audited are very few. Like I think last year, like maybe 2 churches got audited, or maybe it was like the past 5 years, only 2 churches got audited. So you really see that, so should there be stricter tax things? Should the IRS start auditing more churches? And I know after this came out, the IRS even says we should do a better job of investigating these churches. There has been a cry from people who've, have opened up their eyes to this, and they're saying, hey, wait a minute. This is wrong. This is there's an injustice going on here. We should tax every single church here. And I think there's some churches who, are kind of scared. Like, are we going to get taxed? Especially your little small country church that has like maybe 10 or 20 people. If they're going to have to start paying taxes, or if they're going to start to have to pay taxes, or they're not going to get those tax breaks anymore, then how do some of these churches survive? Is that going to destroy the churches? Is that going to destroy the churches in America, or any religious organization? Your Jewish temples, your mosque, your Buddhist temples, whatever? Is that going to cause some damage? Um, Initially, my my first thoughts on this topic is I don't think it's going to happen, and here's why. For two reasons. Um, Again, like John Oliver, his whole thing was against the televangelist. So if the IRS starts looking and they decide to set tax code, you can't just say we're going to go ahead and tax. We're going to go ahead and tax these televangelists here, or these bigger churches, but your smaller churches are still going to have their tax breaks. Well, then there's going to be some type of prejudice, discrimination, and that's going to ensue a big legal battle in court. So I don't think a lot of the tax rules are going to be changed if going to be kind of changed drastically overnight. I think it's something that's going to take a lot of planning. It's something that's going to take a lot of a lot of careful looking at to make sure that all these things go away. So it kind of, the people who do need to get taxed, and the people who don't need to get taxed won't get taxed. I think that's a very tricky line to cross. The other thing is the evangelical churches, and I use the word evangelical very loosely because people like to say evangelical is all churches, but it's not. It's usually these who are kind of like these moral idealists, people who actually usually are very involved in American politics. And that's kind of one of the reasons why, because, a lot of these evangelical ministers, they're involved in, praying with our congressmen, praying with our president. So they have a foot inside the workings of the government, and some of them are probably donors of certain parties, whether it be the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, Tea Party, whatever. And especially with the Tea Party, if we remember, it would have been about a couple years ago where there was this investigation with the IRS because apparently someone in Washington told the IRS in Cincinnati to start investigating the Tea Party, thinking they were terrorists. So obviously, even though the IRS is part of the federal government, but it's supposed to kind of operate unbiasedly, I'm assuming, really there is some bias. So again, if you have these big mega churches who are supporting, who in a way are kind of putting money in senators' pockets, endorsing new presidential candidates, the likelihood of there being a big overhaul in tax breaks is going to be unlikely because, the government likes that money coming in. And if you start to tax them, then that kind of negates money going into their pocket, which then, then starts to cause issues because now people aren't being paid more. Lobbyists don't have the funds to be able to bribe or do whatever. And it's just a really, if you think about it, it's kind of it's kind of a really sick system in a way. Especially when the reason why the founders came over from Europe to America is because of religious persecution. And that's why they said that, that there should be at least a separation between church and state, because when church and the state go hand in hand, bad things happen. Bad things happen for the state, for the livelihood of all people, and bad things happen to the church when there's some type of marriage between the two of them. So I think that's why, so that's one of the reasons why we have that separation. But the other thing is, and actually to kind of talk a little bit about how powerful the evangelical church is, I had a subscription to HBO Now, which is where I saw some of John Oliver's stuff. But then there was also a couple of documentaries, and one was called The Trials of Ted Haggart. Now, if you don't remember who Ted Haggart is, Ted Haggart was an evangelical minister out in Colorado. Did a lot of speaking tours, a very friendly guy, even was involved in praying with congressmen and our president, like probably one of the top evangelical pastors in America. And then breaking news came out that he was involved in a drug and sex scandal with a man. So basically what the church did is they basically fired him from his pastoral job. And what this documentary kind of shows the trials he went through, because he had to basically rebuild his life again. And it was very interesting because he couldn't move, he couldn't go into his house, because he actually owned his house. It wasn't a parsonage, as the documentary kind of alluded to, but he wasn't going to go back to his house. Not only did he get fired, but he had to go kind of like on this year, like spiritual retreat in a way to kind of, get back in the graces of God. And the other thing that I thought was really weird is he was not allowed to enter the state of Colorado. Think about that. The whole state of Colorado. And there's a part of me that goes, what government, really city government or state government, can really ban someone from entering into their state? Like that's very odd and unheard of, especially for somebody that people do all the time. People have drug problems. People have affair problems. Even ministers have those problems, but you don't see them being kicked out of their you don't see them getting kicked out of their state. I mean, you think about Anthony Weiner, who was involved in his sex scandal. He's not kicked out of the state where he's still trying to run to be a politician. We don't see that. But yet with Ted Haggart, we see him totally is not allowed to come back into the state of, basically the state of Colorado, because of this scandal. And there's a part of me that goes, wait a minute. That's very strange. That's really weird. Like, how much power does that church in Colorado have that they can get a man actually kicked out of the state, like almost exiled out of the state for an entire year? So him and his family literally are driving a U-Haul truck with all their stuff, and they've been like stopping at other people's house, staying with them. Occasionally they get a hotel. He's trying to find a job. He's traveling around trying to find work, trying to find a job. And that's very hard, because then people can type in his name and pull him up and go, oh, we don't want this guy. And I think now he's like selling life insurance or health insurance. He's a insurance salesman. But the other interesting thing is he was actually going to do some work and be part of a halfway house and kind of minister to people and help people out in Arizona. And I guess the church in Colorado kind of found out about this and basically shut it down. It like really shut it down. And even him himself is like, these people were my friends, and, we taught that, Jesus loved everyone, but yet they're not very loving of me when I was fallen. So you see how very moralistic this evangelical church is and how much power they have. So going back to the question, are they, will the government, will the IRS be able to change the tax laws, do all this stuff? I don't think so. Because it's just so woven into our government, into how our country works, that it's almost kind of like it won't happen. And I think, the question I posed, and it's interesting because I posed John Oliver as a prophet. And was he a prophet? Was he a prophet? Because I know some people are, I've heard some people criticizing him. Well, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's just spewing stuff that he doesn't know what he's talking about. But here's the interesting thing about a prophet. When we read the Old Testament, especially when we get to the book of the prophets, Israel at that time was a powerhouse. They were, they had King Saul, King David, King Solomon, and then after Solomon, the kingdom split in two. but they were still a powerhouse. They had walls. They had grown enormous to an enormous size. They went from being a tribe of like vagabonds to actually having an entire kingdom. And then these prophets show up, and these prophets are basically saying, hey, all your wealth, all your security, all the way you operate things, even, you being God's chosen people, you guys are very wicked. You guys are very evil. And as the prophets say, if you do not turn away from your wickedness, bad things are going to happen to you. But especially what's very important about a prophet is, when everyone kind of sees their way of life as normal, we're the religious best, everything's good, nothing's going to happen to us, God's on our side, when really God had left them. Because of their wickedness, because of their evil, because the way they were abusing people, how they were worshiping other idols, how they were neglecting the poor amongst their midst. And these prophets are basically kind of shining a light where no priest, no religious leader was going to shine a light in. And these prophets did. And if you think about these prophets, some were part of priests, some were just regular people, some of them were very strange, like Ezekiel, but God was able to use them to really point out the evilness, the disgustingness of the Israelites. And I feel like what John Oliver has done is he has really exposed the ugliness of televangelists and how they are very abusive towards people, because for some of us, we go, oh, no, like this is wrong. Like I can even remember, I'm going to go off the track, and I know my podcast is getting super long because I'm looking at my time, but I can remember watching, me and my roommate, Matthew, were watching TBN, which is one of the big televangelist networks. And as we were we're watching around Easter, and we were watching some like cartoons, but then we're also watching some of these sermons. And you're watching this, and I'm just sitting there, and I'm just watching it. And I remember there was this black lady, black minister who was preaching. And I'm like, okay. And she was very excited, very passionate by what she's preaching. As I'm watching it, I'm kind of getting into it. I'm like, oh yeah, this is awesome. Like, I love this. And she's going, and I'm still kind of getting into it. And for the most part, like, my ears aren't ringing saying, whoa, she's saying some really strange stuff here. Like, everything seemed like to be sound and okay. I'm like, okay. And then she's starting to get a little bit overexcited, I guess. And I'm like, okay, what's this all about? And then she makes a statement. And she says, God is a pimp pimping out his blessings. And when she said it, my initial reaction was yes, because it was like kind of like the climax of her sermon. Like, boom, that was the nail on, that was hitting the nail on the head right there. And I was like, yeah. And then I thought about what she said, and then I'm like, ew, no. And I just started to crack up laughing, like, oh, no, why would you ever say that? But you can see that these televangelists, they're very good at trying to get a response from the crowd. So yeah, if you hear something and you see something and you're really buying into what someone's saying, you're going to go throw money into their trunk. And that's something my professor says. Doesn't matter if it's theologically sound, doesn't matter if it's even Christian or strangely religious or anything that Jesus even said. But if people believe you, if people buy into what you're saying, then they're going to go throw money in your trunk. That's why I think a lot of prosperity gospel is so popular. Just hearing people say, hey, if you give us money, if you go and you give us money, then God's going to make you rich. Or if you do these things, God's going to make you prosperous. God's going to make you rich, which is very interesting because throughout the Bible, Jesus talks about how it's easier for the poor to get into heaven than it is for the rich. So why are we preaching this gospel of do this and you're going to be rich when that's not what Jesus was talking about? Jesus was actually against it. The first should be last and the last should be first. It's the meek, it's the poor that shall inherit the kingdom, not the rich. So again, in conclusion to everything I've been saying, really, it's going to be interesting. I think what John Oliver has done is something that I think needed to be done. It needed to be exposed. But I'm also thinking that, everyone right now is riled up about it. And then after a couple weeks or a month, there's going to be something else big that's going to happen that is going to we're going to kind of forget about this. And it's not going to happen. And there's going to be some stuff that's not going to change. That's just my opinion. Hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully I'm right. Doesn't really matter, but those are just my 2 cents. So again, thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. I appreciate all of my listeners. Again, I'd actually like to know, before I close, actually would like to know what your thoughts are about this. Have you known of somebody or maybe a family member that has in a way been took advantage by a televangelist or even by anybody in the religious community, where it's like, oh, give us money and and your cancer will be cured, or we'll give you this anointing cloth and you'll just rub it all over your body and all your troubles will go away. Like, has anyone ever had that experience? I'd like to know, and I think this is something that that I think we can help each other, because again, when we have a negative experience, especially from a group of people who are supposed to be about love and supposed to have that image of Christ, and we get hurt by someone like that, it really causes a lot of damage and a lot of wounds in us, and maybe this can be the start of healing. So if any of you have had any experience where you were hurt or taken advantage by someone in the religious community, whether that's Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, whatever, I'd like to know. You can go ahead and write your comments on the podcast page. You can go to my website, thescottstedman.com, and you can write your comments right there. And again, on my website, on this link of this podcast, I will have a link of the video for you to watch from last week tonight with John Oliver. All right. Well, thank you for listening, and I hope you guys will have a great week. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
80s televangelists like this guy.
I'm just getting into a prophetic vein. Someone with a digestive tract problems, quickly call. We've seen midgets grow. We've seen arms and legs that stop growing because of growth cells that stop. I don't make this stuff up.
Please, you can't say I don't make this stuff up just 5 seconds after you said the words Manda Casabasanda.